In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a charming stranger, Lionel Grayson, dazzles everyone until he's found strangled in Gossington Hall. Only Miss Marple notices a tiny clue, a single button that doesn't belong, as secrets unravel. She exposes a web of blackmail, jealousy, and hidden pasts, proving the killer's perfect guise is no match for her sharp eye. Will one small clue bring justice to a village on edge? Chapter 1. The Newcomer's Arrival. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, its thatched cottages and winding lanes exuding a timeless serenity. The summer sun cast a golden glow over the hedgerows, and the air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought, and where the arrival of a stranger was an event of considerable note. On this particular morning, the village was abuzz with a hum of excitement that rippled through the tea rooms, the post office, and the vicarage garden. A newcomer had taken up residence at Gossington Hall, the grandest house in the village, and speculation about his identity was already running wild. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the window of her neat little cottage, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Her sharp blue eyes, undimmed by age, gazed out at the lane where Mrs. Price, the village's most indefatigable gossip, was hurrying past with a basket of eggs. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. She knew Mrs. Price would soon be knocking at her door. Within 10 minutes, the doorbell chimed, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside to answer it. "Miss Marple, you'll never guess," Mrs. Price burst out, barely waiting for the door to open fully. Her round face was flushed with excitement, and her bonnet sat slightly askew. "There's a gentleman moved into Gossington Hall, a Mr. Lionel Grayson, they say, ever so wealthy and handsome, came down from London, or so I heard from Mrs. Clement, who had it from the butcher's boy. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple invited Mrs. Price into her small, cozy sitting room, where a tea tray was already prepared. "And what else do we know about this, Mr. Grayson?" Mrs. Price settled into a chair, her basket balanced precariously on her lap. "Well, he's a bachelor, that's certain. Youngish 40, perhaps. Drives a fine motor car, a sleek black thing. And he's taken on half the village to work at the hall. Mrs. Bantry saw him at the station, all charm and smiles, with a valet and trunks full of clothes. She says he's got a look about him like a film star, but nobody knows where his money comes from. Could be trade, could be inheritance, or something else entirely." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper on the last words. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was already turning over the details. A wealthy bachelor, arriving with fanfare, was bound to stir the village's curiosity. She had seen many such newcomers in her time, some genuine, some hiding secrets behind their polished exteriors. "I suppose we shall learn more about him soon enough," she remarked. "People do talk, don't they?" Mrs. Price nodded vigorously. "Oh, they do," tipping his hat to everyone, like a proper gentleman. And Tom Harris, her fiancé, didn't look too pleased about it. "Jealous, I reckon. Clara is such a pretty thing, and Mr. Grayson's bound to notice." Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet clicking. Clara Langley was a sweet girl with a cascade of auburn hair and a shy smile. Tom, on the other hand, had a temper, The men speculated over pints of ale about his business dealings. At the Women's Institute, the ladies debated whether he was a widower or simply a confirmed bachelor. And at the vicarage, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was planning a welcome tea to introduce Mr. Grayson to St. Mary Mead's society. Miss Marple, invited as a matter of course, decided to attend. There was no better way to observe a newcomer than in the midst of a village gathering, where tongues were loose and facades sometimes slipped. The tea was held 2 days later in the vicarage garden, a charming affair with trestle tables laden with scones, jam, and Victoria sponge. The roses were in full bloom, and a soft breeze carried the scent of lavender. Mr. Lionel Grayson arrived precisely on time, stepping out of his gleaming black Bentley with the air of a man accustomed to attention. He was tall, with dark hair, swept back from a high forehead, and his tailored suit spoke of wealth and taste. His smile was warm, his handshake firm, and his conversation effortlessly charming. He complimented Mrs. Clement on her roses, discussed cricket with the vicar, and even listened patiently to Mrs. Price's lengthy account of her cousin's rheumatism. There was something about Mr. Grayson's ease that felt practiced, almost too perfect. She had known men like him before, men who could charm a room, but whose eyes never quite matched their smiles. His were a striking green, bright and alert, but they darted occasionally, as if scanning for something or someone. When he spoke to Clara Langley, who blushed under his attention, Miss Marple noted the way Tom Harris's jaw tightened, his hand gripping his teacup a little too firmly. Miss Marple, what do you think of our new neighbor? Mrs. Bantry, a cheerful widow with a penchant for gossip, settled beside her. Mrs. Bantry's late husband had been a colonel, and she still carried herself with the confidential stist. Chapter 1. The newcomer's arrival continued confidence of an officer's wife. He seems a delightful man, doesn't he? So polished, so worldly, quite a change from our usual quiet types. Miss Marple nodded absently, her eyes still on Grayson as he laughed at something Clara said. Indeed, he does bring a certain sparkle to St. Mary Mead. Her tone was neutral, but her mind was cataloguing every detail. The way valet hovered nearby, the expensive watch on his wrist, the faint trace of an accent London perhaps, but with a hint of something foreign. She wondered if anyone else had noticed these things, or if they were too dazzled by his charm. The tea party continued. He spoke of his love for the countryside, his plans to restore Gossington Hall to its former glory, and his hope to become one of the village family. The words were well chosen, Miss Marple thought, designed to endear him to a close-knit community wary of outsiders. Yet there was something in his manner, slight hesitation before answering, questions about his past that piqued her curiosity further. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple chatted with the other guests, gleaning snippets of information. The butcher's boy had seen Grayson's valet unloading crates marked fragile late at night. The postmistress mentioned a stream of letters arriving for Grayson, some with foreign postmarks. And young Clara, blushing again, admitted Grayson had promised to show her the Hall's famous rose garden, an invitation that had clearly unsettled Tom by the time the tea ended. Miss Marple had formed a picture of Lionel Grayson, a man of wealth and charm, but with a past shrouded in mystery. She returned to her cottage, her mind turning over the details like pieces of a puzzle. The button she had imagined in her initial outline wasn't yet part of the story, but she knew something Small a trifle others might overlook would eventually surface. For now, she noted Grayson's effect on the village, the excitement, the envy, the undercurrent of unease among those like Tom who felt their world disrupted. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving steadily. The village was smitten with Mr. Grayson, but she was not so easily swayed. She had seen too many charming strangers in her time, and charm, she knew, could hide a multitude of sins. St. Mary Mead was a peaceful place, but peace, like a still pond, could be disturbed by the smallest stone, and Miss Marple had a feeling that Lionel Grayson was no small stone. Over the next few days, Grayson settled into village life. He attended church, donated generously to the Restoration Fund, and hosted a small gathering at Gossington Hall to thank the villagers for their warm welcome. Of Grayson's late mother, a woman with the same striking green eyes. "He's ever so kind," Cherry said, "but he kept asking about the village. Who's who owes what to whom. A man like Grayson didn't come to a place like St. Mary Mead by chance. He had a purpose, and she intended to discover it." She thought of the village's web of relationships, Mrs. Price's endless chatter, Mrs. Bantry's social ambitions, Clara's starry-eyed admiration, Tom's quiet resentment. Somewhere in that web was a thread that didn't belong, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. As she prepared for bed, she glanced out her window at the dark silhouette of Gossington Hall, its windows glowing faintly in the distance. The village was her domain, its people, her friends and neighbors. She would watch Mr. Grayson closely, for St. Mary Mead had its secrets, but so, she suspected, did he? Chapter 2. A shocking discovery. The morning sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the lace curtains of the village's quaint cottages and spilling onto the cobblestone paths. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew-soaked roses and freshly baked bread from Mrs. Baker's shop. It was a morning like any other, or so it seemed, until a piercing scream shattered the tranquility. Echoing from the direction of Gossington Hall, Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a slice of buttered toast, paused mid-sip. Her sharp blue eyes, framed by delicate spectacles, flicked toward the window. The scream had come from the direction of the grand estate, a Georgian manor that stood at the edge of the village. Its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys, a constant reminder of its storied past. Miss Marple set her teacup down with a soft clink, her mind already turning over possibilities. Screams, in her experience, were rarely without cause in a village as small as St. Mary Mead. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and stepped outside, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the path. A small crowd had already gathered near the gates of Gossington Hall, their murmurs buzzing like bees in a hive. Mrs. Price, the village's most enthusiastic gossip, stood at the forefront, her hands gesticulating wildly as she spoke to a cluster of neighbors. Miss Marple approached quietly, her unassuming presence allowing her to blend into the background, a habit she had perfected over years of observing human nature. "What's happened, Mrs. Price?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but laced with curiosity. Mrs. Price turned, her eyes wide with the thrill of calamity. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. Mr. Grayson dead. Found in the library, they say, strangled with a silk scarf. Can you imagine, in our village?" Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, but her expression remained composed. "Dear me," she said softly. "How very shocking. Who found him?" "That young maid, Elsie," Mrs. Price replied, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "She went in to dust the library this morning, and there he was, sprawled on the floor, cold as stone. She screamed loud enough to wake the dead. Pardon the expression." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through the details. Mr. Lionel Grayson, the charming newcomer who had taken up residence at Gossington Hall only a month ago, was no more. His arrival had caused a stir, with his polished manners and easy smile winning over most of the village, though not, Miss Marple noted herself. There had been something about his demeanor, a touch too calculated, that had pricked at her instincts, and now, it seemed, her instincts had been proven right. The police arrived shortly after, their black car rumbling up the drive to Gossington Hall. Inspector Craddock, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense air, stepped out, his face set in a grim line. Miss Marple knew him well. He was competent, if a bit rigid in his methods, and he had come to value her insights in past cases, though he was loath to admit it. He tipped his hat to her as he passed, his eyes briefly meeting hers before he disappeared into the manor. Miss Marple lingered near the gates, listening as the villagers speculated. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, wrung her hands, muttering about the tragedy of such a young life cut short. Clara Langley, the pretty young woman engaged to Tom Harris, stood pale and silent, her eyes darting toward the hall. Tom, at her side, gripped her hand tightly, his jaw clenched. Miss Marple noted their tension, filing it away for later consideration. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple made her way toward Gossington Hall, her steps slow but purposeful. She had no official business there, of course, but she knew the housekeeper, Mrs. Brooks, who had a soft spot for her homemade damson jam. A neighborly visit, she reasoned, would hardly raise eyebrows, and it might afford her a glimpse of the scene. Mrs. Brooks, flustered but welcoming, ushered Miss Marple into the kitchen, where the air was thick with the scent of baking bread and anxiety. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's awful," she said, pouring tea with trembling hands. Mr. Grayson was such a gentleman, always so kind to the staff, who could do such a thing. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, accepting the cup. "It's most distressing. I don't suppose you saw anything unusual this morning?" Mrs. Brooks shook her head. "Nothing, miss. Elsie found him, poor girl. She's in a right state, upstairs, with a cup of tea and a sedative. The police are in the library now, poking about." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind working. "The library, you say? Such a grand room. I suppose they've cordoned it off." "Oh, yes," Mrs. Brooks said. "Inspector Craddock's got his men everywhere. They're saying it was a robbery, what with Mr. Grayson's watch missing and the desk drawers all rummaged through." Miss Marple nodded, though she privately doubted the robbery theory. A thief would hardly linger to strangle his victim with a silk scarfer, curiously personal method of murder. She finished her tea and, with a few kind words, persuaded Mrs. Brooks to let her take a peek at the library, just to pay my respects, in a manner of speaking. The library was a cavernous room, its walls lined with mahogany bookshelves, and its windows draped in heavy velvet curtains. The air was heavy with the scent of old leather and polish, undercut by a faint, unsettling metallic temps. Inspector Craddock stood near the desk, speaking in low tones to a constable, while another officer dusted for fingerprints. In the center of the room, sprawled on the Persian rug, was the body of Mr. Lionel Grayson. Miss Marple's eyes took in the scene with practiced precision. Grayson was dressed in a well-tailored suit, his face pale, and his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The silk scarf, a deep burgundy, was still knotted tightly around his neck, its ends trailing onto the rug. The desk was indeed in disarray, papers scattered and drawers half open. But something about the scene struck Miss Marple as odd. The chaos felt deliberate, almost theatrical, as if someone had wanted it to look like a robbery. Her gaze drifted to the floor, and there, just a few feet from Grayson's outstretched hand, she saw it, a single button, small and unobtrusive, lying against the edge of the rug. It was a curious thing, dark blue with a faint sheen, and it did not match the buttons on Grayson's suit, which were silver and embossed with a subtle crest. Miss Marple bent down, as if adjusting her shoe, and studied the button more closely. It was made of fine wool, pitted slightly, as if it had been worn smooth by time. She straightened, her mind already turning over possibilities. "Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock said, noticing her presence. "I might have known you'd find your way here." She smiled faintly. "Just paying my respects, Inspector. Such a terrible business." "Have you any theories?" Craddock sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Looks like a robbery gone wrong. His watch is gone, and there's a safe in the wall that's been tampered with. But the strangulation, that's a puzzle. Not your typical thief's method. It's rather fine, isn't it?" "Belonged to Grayson, we think," Craddock said. "Found a matching one in his wardrobe. Maybe the killer grabbed it in the moment." Miss Marple nodded, though she doubted it. The scarf was too neatly knotted, too deliberate. She glanced at the button again, its presence nagging at her. "I don't suppose you noticed anything small, Inspector. A trifle, perhaps, that might seem insignificant." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You've got that look, Miss Marple. What have you seen?" "Oh, nothing of consequence," she said lightly. "Just an old woman's fancy. But do keep an eye out for the little things, won't you? They so often tell a story." Craddock chuckled, though there was a hint of respect in his eyes. "I'll keep that in mind. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a crime scene to manage." Miss Marple left the library, her mind buzzing. The button was no accident, she was certain. It was out of place, a tiny anomaly in a carefully staged scene. As she walked back to her cottage, she thought of the villagers she had seen that morning: Mrs. Price, with her sharp tongue; Clara, with her nervous glances; Tom, with his protective grip; and the others who had flocked to the gates. Someone she knew was hiding a secret, and that button was the key to unraveling it. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she thought. The button was from a woman's coat. She was almost certain its size and texture suggested as much. But whose, and why had it been left behind? A struggle, perhaps, or a moment of carelessness. She closed her eyes, letting her mind wander back to the village, to the faces and voices she knew so well. St. Mary Mead was a small place, but it held its share of secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover this one. The day wore on, and the village remained in a state of shock. By afternoon, the news had spread to every corner, and the tea shop was abuzz with theories. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the window where she could listen without drawing attention. Mrs. Baker, the shop's owner, was recounting the morning's events to a group of women, her voice trembling with excitement. "They say he was strangled in cold blood," Mrs. Baker said, wiping her hands on her apron. "And the police are questioning everyone who was near the hall last night. I heard Clara Langley was seen arguing with him just yesterday." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Clara, the young woman with the wide eyes and nervous hands. She had been at the hall, then, and not on friendly terms with Grayson. Interesting. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing the detail along the asterisk. Button had been dropped earlier, unrelated to the murder, but no, that felt wrong. It was too specific, too out of place. By evening, Inspector Craddock paid her a visit, his face weary but determined. "Thought you might like to know we're looking into a few leads," he said, settling into her parlor with a cup of tea. "Grayson wasn't what he seemed. We found papers in his room suggesting he had a shady past, some business dealings that went sour. Might give us a motive." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes bright. "That's very interesting, Inspector. And the button? Did your men find anything else like it?" Craddock looked surprised. "You're still on about that button? It's just a bit of rubbish, probably dropped by a maid. Doesn't match anything Grayson was wearing." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But it's curious, don't you think? A button from a woman's coat lying so close to the body. I wonder if it might belong to someone who was there that night." Craddock frowned, jotting a note in his pocketbook. "I'll have it looked at, but I'm not holding my breath. We've got bigger fish to fry. Clara Langley, for one. She's admitted to arguing with Grayson about some money he owed her. And then there's that gardener, Stokes. He's got a record, you know." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh yes, Mr. Stokes. A rough sort, but I wonder if he's quite clever enough for this. Strangling is such an intimate act, don't you think? It requires a certain resolve." Craddock stared at her, then shook his head. "You've got a way of making the simplest things sound sinister, Miss Marple. I'll keep you posted." As he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind racing. The button was the key, she was certain, but its story was still hidden. She thought of Clara, of Mrs. Price, of the quiet widow, Mrs. Langley, who had been conspicuously absent from the morning's gossip. And then there was Mrs. Bantry, whose elegant coat might hold a clue or might not. The village was full of possibilities, and Miss Marple knew that patience and observation would lead her to the truth. Over the next few days, the investigation deepened, but the button remained a mystery. Miss Marple visited Gossington Hall again, this time under the pretense of returning a borrowed book to Mrs. Brooks. She lingered near the library, noting the window where the button had been found. The sill was high, but not impossible to climb, and the garden below showed no obvious signs of disturbance. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the button had been dropped in haste. Perhaps, as the killer fled, she returned home and examined her own collection of buttons, a habit from years of sewing and mending. The button from the crime scene was distinctive, its woolen texture suggesting a coat of quality, perhaps one worn by someone of means. Mrs. Bantry's name came to mind again, but Miss Marple dismissed it for now. Mrs. Bantry was too forthright, too open to be involved in something so clandestine. Or was she? As the village settled into an uneasy routine, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. She attended church on Sunday, noting the absence of Clara and Tom, and overheard Mrs. Price whispering about a scandal involving Grayson and a local woman. The details were vague, but Miss Marple stored them away, knowing that even the wildest rumors often held a grain of truth by the end of the week. The button was still on her mind, a tiny puzzle piece that refused to fit. She decided to take a walk past Clara's house, where Mrs. Langley, Clara's mother, lived. The garden was neat, the curtains drawn, but there, hanging on a clothesline, was a dark blue coat, its buttons glinting in the sunlight. Miss Marple paused, her heart quickening. The buttons were similar, but one was missing. The thread frayed as if it had been torn off. She made a mental note to speak to Mrs. Langley, but carefully. The woman was reserved, almost invisible in the village's social circles, and Miss Marple suspected she was hiding more than grief. As she walked back to her cottage, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift, forming a picture that was still incomplete but growing clearer. The button, the scarf, the staged robbery all pointed to a killer who was clever but not infallible. Miss Marple knew that the truth lay in the details, and she was determined to find it, one stitch at a time. Chapter 3. The Village Whispers. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead's cozy tea-room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak tables. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked scones and the murmur of voices, each layered with curiosity and speculation. The death of Mr. Lionel Grayson at Gossington Hall had set the village alight with gossip, and the tea-room, owned by the ever-talkative Mrs. Pudicombe, was the epicenter of it all. Villagers gathered in clusters, their teacups clinking as they leaned closer to share theories about the charming newcomer's untimely end. At a corner table, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, her sharp eyes and ears attuned to every word. Mrs. Pudicombe bustled over, her apron dusted with flour, her round face flushed with the excitement of serving both tea and tidbits of scandal. "Miss Marple, another cup of Earl Grey?" she asked, her voice loud enough to draw glances from nearby tables. "Thank you, Mrs. Pudicombe," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile, her tone as soft as the pale pink cardigan she wore. "And perhaps one of your delightful scones. They do wonders for one's concentration." Mrs. Pudicombe beamed, oblivious to the fact that Miss Marple's concentration was not on the scones but on the conversations swirling around her. As the tea-room owner hurried off, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the other patrons. At a table by the window, Mrs. Price, the village's most dedicated gossip, held court with a group of women, her voice carrying over the clatter of china. Opposite her sat Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. Nearby, Clara Langley and Tom Harris, the young couple who had been seen near Gossington Hall the night of the murder, sat stiffly, their hands clasped tightly under the table. Miss Marple's needles paused as she caught a snippet of Mrs. Price's animated monologue. "I'm telling you, he wasn't what he seemed," Mrs. Price declared, her eyes wide with conviction. "All that charm, that fancy talk about his travels. Mark my words, Lionel Grayson was hiding something. Why else would someone strangle him in his own library?" Mrs. Clement frowned, stirring her tea absently. "It's dreadful to think about, Mrs. Price, but surely it was a thief, as Inspector Craddock says, someone passing through, looking for valuables." Mrs. Price snorted, her double chin quivering. "A thief who leaves behind a silver cigarette case and a gold watch. No, no, this was personal. I heard from Mrs. Bantry's maid that Grayson had enemies, people he crossed in London. Perhaps one of them followed him here. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene, but her mind racing. Mrs. Price's penchant for exaggeration was well known, but there was often a kernel of truth buried in her embellishments. The idea of Grayson having enemies wasn't new. Miss Marple had sensed something amiss about the man from the moment he arrived. His charm too polished, his stories too neatly rehearsed. But what intrigued her more was the button she had noticed. At the crime scene, a small, elegant thing made of fine wool, pitted against Grayson's body, yet not matching his tailored suit. It was an anomaly, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that anomalies were the threads that, when pulled, unraveled the tightest of guises. She glanced at Clara and Tom, noting the tension in their postures. Clara, a pretty girl with auburn hair and a nervous habit of twisting her bracelet, kept her eyes fixed on her teacup. Tom, broad-shouldered and earnest, leaned toward her, whispering something that made her flinch. Miss Marple wondered what they were hiding. She had seen them arguing with Grayson at the village fete a week before his death, their voices hushed but heated. Clara had seemed on the verge of tears, and Tom's protective glare had been unmistakable. Were they simply upset about a trivial matter, or was there more to their connection with Grayson? The tea-room door jingled, and Mrs. Bantry entered, her tweed coat swishing as she made her way to Mrs. Clement's table. The widow of Colonel Bantry, she was a woman of means and impeccable taste, her presence commanding attention. Miss Marple noted the coat of fine wool, similar in texture to the button she had seen, though she couldn't be sure without closer inspection. Mrs. Bantry's face was flushed, her usual composure tinged with agitation. "Good morning, Dolly," Mrs. Clement said warmly, gesturing to an empty chair. "You look as though you've had quite a morning." Mrs. Bantry sank into the seat, fanning herself with a gloved hand. "Oh, Margaret, it's this dreadful business with Mr. Grayson." The police were at Gossington Hall again, poking about the library. Inspector Craddock asked me all sorts of questions about who visited the hall, as if I keep a guest book for every passer-by. Mrs. Price leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Did they find anything new? I heard they're looking for a scarf silk. Very expensive. The murder weapon, they say." Mrs. Bantry's lips pursed. "I don't know about any scarf, but they're certainly thorough. They even asked about the gardener, that Stokes fellow. Shady character, if you ask me. Always lurking about with that sullen look." Miss Marple's knitting resumed, her movements slow and deliberate. Mr. Stokes, the gardener at Gossington Hall, had caught her attention as well. A man with a rough demeanor and a rumored criminal past, he had been seen near the hall the night of the murder, but Miss Marple wasn't convinced he was the killer. His type, gruff, opportunistic, was more likely to steal than to strangle, and the crime scene had been too carefully arranged for a man of his temperament. No, the murderer was someone with finesse, someone who could blend into the village's polite society while hiding a darker intent. As the conversation at Mrs. Clement's table turned to the weather, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the button. It was an unusual clue, not only because it didn't belong to Grayson, but because it had been found near the body, pitted against it as if dropped in haste. The police had overlooked it, assuming it was part of the room's clutter, but Miss Marple knew better. In her experience, the smallest details often held the greatest significance. She recalled the texture of the button, smooth, finely crafted, likely from a woman's coat, but whose Mrs. Bantry's coat was a possibility, but so were those of other women in the village. Clara's mother, Mrs. Langley, was a quiet, unassuming widow who had seemed unusually withdrawn since Grayson's arrival. And then there was Mrs. Price, whose flashy wardrobe often included expensive fabrics, though her taste leaned toward the garish. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the inconsistencies in the villagers' stories. Mrs. Price had claimed to barely know Grayson, yet she spoke of him with a familiarity that suggested otherwise. Mrs. Bantry, who rented Gossington Hall to Grayson, had been evasive about their interactions, mentioning only brief meetings about the lease. Clara and Tom's argument with Grayson hinted at a deeper connection, perhaps a promise or debt. And Mr. Stokes, with his criminal record, was an obvious suspect. But his alibi working late in the garden shed had been corroborated by a neighbor. The tea room grew noisier as more villagers arrived, each adding their own version of the story. Mr. Puddicombe, the butcher, insisted Grayson was a gambler who owed money to dangerous men. Miss Hartnell, the spinster who ran the post office, swore she had seen a shadowy figure near Gossington Hall the night of the murder. Even the vicar, Mr. Clement, joined the speculation, suggesting Grayson's death was a tragic accident, a misunderstanding gone wrong. Miss Marple listened to it all, her mind sifting through the noise for the truth. She thought back to the crime scene, which she had visited briefly under the pretense of returning a book to Mrs. Bantry. The library at Gossington Hall was a grand room lined with mahogany shelves and heavy drapes. Grayson's body had been found near the fireplace, the silk scarf still knotted around his neck. The police had noted signs of a struggle, overturned books, a shattered vase, but Miss Marple had seen something else, the absence of chaos. The room felt staged, as if the killer had arranged it to look like a robbery. And then there was the button lying near the body, its presence a silent accusation. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster as she pieced together the puzzle. The button was the key, but its significance lay in its owner. She needed to learn more about the women in the village who might own such a coat. Mrs. Bantry was an obvious candidate, but her forthright nature made her an unlikely murderer. Mrs. Langley, Clara's mother, was more intriguing. She had kept to herself since Grayson's arrival, avoiding the village's social gatherings. Miss Marple recalled seeing her at the fete, her face pale and her hands fidgeting with her scarf. There was something there, a thread to follow. The tea-room door jingled again, and Inspector Craddock entered, his expression weary but determined. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on Miss Marple for a moment before moving on. She smiled faintly, knowing he valued her insights, but preferred to keep her at arm's length. Craddock made his way to Mrs. Bantry's table, exchanging polite greetings before asking to speak with her privately. The other villagers watched with bated breath, their whispers growing louder as the pair stepped outside. Miss Marple finished her scone, brushing crumbs from her lap. She had no intention of intruding on Craddock's investigation, at least, not overtly. Instead, she would continue her own quiet inquiries, starting with a visit to Mrs. Langley. The widow lived in a modest cottage on the edge of the village, a place. Chapter 4. The Buttons. Secret. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair, by the window of her cottage, the soft morning light filtering through the lace curtains. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a pair of soft wool socks for her nephew Raymond taking shape beneath her deft fingers. But her mind was far from the loops and stitches. It was fixed on a single, perplexing object, a small, round button, no larger than a shilling, with a delicate pattern etched into its surface. It was made of fine wool, dyed a deep navy, and it had been found on the library floor of Gossington Hall, near the body of Mr. Lionel Grayson. The button did not belong to Grayson's tailored suit, nor did it match the silk scarf used to strangle him. It was, Miss Marple thought, a tiny anomaly in an otherwise carefully staged scene, a clue that whispered of secrets yet to be uncovered. The village of St. Mary. Mead was still reeling from the shock of Grayson's murder. The grand library of Gossington Hall, with its polished oak shelves and heavy velvet drapes, had become a place of grim fascination. The police, under the steady hand of Inspector Craddock, had combed the room for evidence, but their focus had been on the obvious: the scarf, the overturned chair, the scattered papers suggesting a struggle. To them, the button was a trifle, likely dropped by a guest or a servant long before the crime. But Miss Marple knew better. In her long experience of human nature, it was often the smallest details, the misplaced word, the nervous glance, the overlooked trinket that held the key to unraveling a mystery. She set her knitting aside and reached for the button, which she had carefully stored in a small porcelain dish on her side table. Inspector Craddock, with his usual courtesy, had allowed her to examine it after she'd expressed a quiet interest during one of his visits. The button was well crafted, its edges smooth and its surface slightly worn, as if it had been handled often. The wool was of high quality, suggesting it came from a garment of some expense. Miss Marple turned it over in her fingers, her sharp blue eyes narrowing. "A woman's coat," she murmured to herself. "Not a man's, not Grayson's, but whose?" The question had been nagging at her since she'd first seen the button, glinting faintly in the dust near the library's fireplace. The police had noted its positions some 10 feet from Grayson's body, closer to the tall window that overlooked the rose garden. The window had been slightly ajar, its latch undone, hinting that the killer might have fled outside after the deed. Miss Marple pictured the scene: the dark library, the struggle, the scarf tightening around Grayson's throat, and then a button, torn loose in a moment of haste, rolling across the floor unnoticed. But whose haste, and why, had no one claimed the button or mentioned a missing one? She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt, and crossed to the small writing desk where she kept her notebook. It was a habit she'd developed over the years, jotting down observations and connections that might otherwise slip through the cracks of memory. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "Button navy wool, fine quality, woman's, coat found near window, killers, victim's acquaintance, check village coats." She paused, tapping the pencil against her lips. The button was a clue, but it was not enough on its own. It needed context, a thread to tie it to a person, a motive, a moment. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, slipping the notebook into a drawer. The door opened to reveal Dolly Bantry, her old friend and the former mistress of Gossington Hall, now living in a smaller cottage nearby, since the hall had been let to Grayson. Mrs. Bantry's round face was flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with the thrill of gossip. "Jane, you'll never guess what I've heard." Mrs. Bantry said, bustling into the room and settling onto the sofa without waiting for an invitation. The whole village is talking about it. They're saying Grayson wasn't who he claimed to be at all. A swindler, Jane, a proper con artist. Can you imagine? Miss Marple smiled faintly, offering her friend a cup of tea from the tray she'd prepared earlier. The village does love a good story, Dolly, but what exactly are they saying? Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Well, Mrs. Price, you know how she hears everything, says her cousin in London knew a man who sounds awfully like Grayson. A charming fellow, always dressed to the nines. But he'd swindled half a dozen people out of their savings before disappearing. Changed his name, they say, and came here to start fresh. But someone must have found out, don't you think? That's why he was killed? Miss Marple poured the tea, her expression serene but her mind racing. Mrs. Bantry's gossip, while often exaggerated, had a kernel of truth more often than not. If Grayson had been a swindler, it opened up a host of possibilities. Blackmail, perhaps revenge. Someone in St. Mary Mead might have known his secret and confronted him, more been confronted by him. The button, she thought, might belong to someone Grayson had wronged. Someone who had come to the library that night to settle a score. That's very interesting, Dolly, Miss Marple said, handing her friend a cup. But we mustn't jump to conclusions. Tell me, have you noticed anyone in the village wearing a navy coat? A fine wool one, perhaps? Mrs. Bantry blinked, caught off guard by the shift in topic. A navy coat? Well, let me think. I have one myself, of course, but it's more of a tweed, and the buttons are leather. Mrs. Price has a dreadful old thing, all frayed at the cuffs, but I don't think it's navy. Clara Langley, that pretty young girl, has a smart coat, but it's green, I think. Why do you ask? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her face giving nothing away, just a passing thought. I saw a button at the hall, you see, and it made me curious. It's probably nothing. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. A button at the crime scene. Oh, Jane, you're up to something, aren't you? You always are. What does it mean? Nothing yet, Miss Marple said lightly. But I do like to notice things. Now, tell me more about this cousin of Mrs. Price's. What did he say about Grayson? Mrs. Bantry launched into a detailed account of the gossip, but Miss Marple's mind was only half on the conversation. The button was a puzzle piece, and she needed to find where it fit. A woman's coat, fine wool, navy blue. It suggested someone of means, or at least someone who dressed carefully. But St. Mary Mead was a small village, and fine coats were not uncommon among its more prosperous residents. Mrs. Bantry, Mrs. Price, even Mrs. Langley, Clara's mother, might own such a garment. And then there was Clara herself, a young woman, with a quiet beauty and a nervous air, who had been seen arguing with Grayson just days before his death. Miss Marple decided she needed to see the crime scene again. Inspector Craddock had been kind enough to let her visit Gossington Hall once before, under the pretense of retrieving a book she'd lent to the late Mrs. Bantry. He was a sensible man, but he didn't always see the value in the little things, the domestic details that Miss Marple knew could make or break a case. She would ask to go again, perhaps with Mrs. Bantry in tow, to keep things sociable. The next morning, Miss Marple, dressed in her best tweed suit and a neat hat, her appearance as unassuming as ever. She called on Mrs. Bantry, who was delighted. at the prospect of another visit to Gossington Hall. "It's like stepping back in time, Jane," she said as they walked up the gravel drive. "I can't believe that dreadful man was living in my house." The hall was quiet, its grandeur slightly dimmed by the absence of its tenant. Inspector Craddock had left a constable on duty, a young man named Harris, who looked faintly bored. As he stood by the front door, he recognized Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry, and let them in with a polite nod, though he followed them at a discreet distance. The library was much as Miss Marple remembered it, a large, elegant room with tall windows, heavy furniture, and shelves lined with leather-bound books. The chalk outline of Grayson's body had been removed, but the memory of it lingered, a faint shadow on the polished floor. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The window near where the button had been found was still slightly ajar, its latch loose. She knelt carefully, pretending to adjust her shoe, and studied the floor. "Dolly," she said softly, "do you recall if this window was open when you lived here?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, thinking, "Open? Well, I suppose it might have been, in summer. But it's been chilly lately, hasn't it? I'd have thought Grayson would keep it shut." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving to the rose garden outside. The garden was overgrown, its paths muddy from recent rain. If the killer had fled through the window, they might have left footprints, but the police had found none. Perhaps the rain had washed them away. Perhaps the killer had been careful. She stood, brushing her hands together, and turned her attention to the fireplace, where the button had been found. "Constable Harris," she called, her voice gentle but firm. "Could you tell me exactly where that button was found? I believe it was near here." The young constable looked surprised but stepped forward. "Right about there, ma'am," he said, pointing to a spot near the hearth, just under the edge of the rug. "We thought it might have been there for ages." Miss Marple smiled. "Thank you, dear. It's just that I'm so clumsy with my own buttons. I like to know where things end up." Harris nodded, clearly unconvinced that an old lady's interest in buttons was worth pursuing. But Miss Marple was already piecing things together. The button had been under the rug, not on it. Chapter 5. Suspects emerge. The morning after the shocking discovery of Mr. Lionel Grayson's body in the library of Gossington Hall, the village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with an electric undercurrent of speculation and unease. The air was crisp, with the faint scent of autumn leaves carried on a breeze that rustled through the hedgerows. The villagers, usually content with their predictable routines, found themselves drawn into a whirlwind of whispers and theories about the charismatic stranger who had met such a grim fate. At the heart of it all, Inspector Craddock and his team combed through the grand estate, their boots leaving faint impressions in the dew-soaked grass, while Miss Jane Marple, ever observant, sat quietly in her cottage, her knitting needles clicking softly as she turned over the puzzle in her mind. Inspector Craddock, a sturdy man in his early 40s with a nonsense demeanor, stood in the library of Gossington Hall, his notebook open and his brow furrowed. The room, with its towering bookshelves and heavy velvet curtains, still bore the faint metallic temps of blood, though Grayson's body had been removed to the morgue. The silk scarf, a delicate thing with intricate gold embroidery, lay in an evidence bag on the mahogany table, its elegance a stark contrast to the violence it had wrought. Craddock's men had dusted 4 fingerprints, catalogued every item in the room, and photographed the scene from every angle. But the inspector's instincts told him this was no simple robbery gone wrong, as the initial report suggested. Room felt too orderly, the struggle too contained. And then there was the button, a small, unassuming thing, found pitted against the body, its dark green wool and silver rim glinting faintly in the morning light. It didn't belong to Grayson's tailored suit, and that discrepancy nagged at Craddock, though he couldn't yet place why Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken her usual morning walk through the village, her sharp eyes noting the subtle shifts in behavior among her neighbors. Mrs. Price, the village's self-appointed gossip, stood outside the post office, her voice carrying over the cobblestones as she regaled a small crowd with her theories about Grayson's demise. "A thief, mark my words," she declared, her hands flapping like agitated birds. He had that look about him too smooth, too rich, probably crossed the wrong sort in London, and they followed him here. The crowd nodded, their faces a mix of fascination and fear, but Miss Marple, pausing to adjust her shawl, thought Mrs. Price's indignation seemed a touch too fervent, as if she were deflecting attention from something closer to home at the vicarage. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was less theatrical but no less shaken. Over tea, she confided in Miss Marple, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "It's dreadful, Jane," she said, her voice low. "Mr. Grayson was so charming, so generous at the church fundraiser. Who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes flicking to Mrs. Clement's nervous fingers. "People are not always what they seem, Margaret," she said softly, her tone carrying the weight of years spent observing the hidden currents of human nature. She made a mental note of Mrs. Clement's unease, wondering if it stemmed from grief or something more personal. The young couple, Clara and Tom, were another point of interest. Miss Marple had seen them that morning, walking arm in arm near the village green, their heads bent close together. Clara, a pretty girl with auburn hair and a quiet demeanor, had seemed distracted, her eyes darting toward Gossington Hall as if drawn by an invisible thread. Tom, broad-shouldered and earnest, kept a protective arm around her, but his jaw was tight, his expression guarded. Miss Marple recalled a snippet of gossip from the tea party. Clara had been seen arguing with Grayson just days before his death, her voice raised in the garden of Gossington Hall. The details were murky, but the incident piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. What could a young woman like Clara have to argue about with a man like Grayson? Back at Gossington Hall, Inspector Craddock gathered his notes and called a meeting with his team in the drawing room, a grand space with faded wallpaper and a chandelier that cast soft prisms across the ceiling. He laid out the facts as they stood. Lionel Grayson, aged 42. Found strangled with a silk scarf at approximately 10 p.m. the previous night. No signs of forced entry, no missing valuables, and no witnesses, at least none who had come forward. The button, however, was the anomaly. Its presence suggested a struggle, perhaps a clue to the killer's identity, but its significance remained elusive. Craddock's sergeant, a young man named Harris, suggested it might have been dropped by a servant, but Craddock shook his head. The staff were accounted for last night, and none of their uniforms match this button. It's too fine, too specific. We need to find its owner. By midday, Craddock had compiled a list of suspects, each with a potential motive. First was Clara Langley, the young woman who had argued with Grayson. Witnesses reported she'd been upset, her face flushed, as she left the garden, though no one could confirm the nature of their disagreement. Tom Harper, Clara's fiancé, was next on the list. His protective nature and rumored jealousy made him a person of interest, especially since he'd been seen near Gossington Hall on the night of the murder, claiming he was taking a walk. Mrs. Price, despite her loud protestations of innocence, was another suspect. Her fascination with Grayson's wealth was no secret, and her husband's business had been struggling, giving her a financial motive. Finally, there was Mr. Stokes, the gardener at Gossington Hall, a gruff man with a criminal record for petty theft in his youth. He'd been seen lurking near the library window the evening of the murder, though he claimed he was pruning the roses. Miss Marple, informed of these developments through her network of village contacts, sat in her garden, her knitting abandoned for the moment as she sipped a cup of chamomile tea. The button preoccupied her thoughts. Inspector Craddock had shared a photograph of it with her, knowing her knack for noticing what others overlooked. It was small, no larger than a sixpence, with a silver rim and a core of dark green wool, the kind used in holiday garments. It didn't match Grayson's clothing, which was all tailored silk and fine cotton, nor did it belong to the staff's plain uniforms. Miss Marple's mind turned to the women of the village. A woman's coat, she thought, or perhaps a cardigan. Someone of means, someone who could afford fine wool, but who, as the afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the village, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Bantry, a respectable widow who lived in a tidy cottage near the church. Mrs. Bantry was known for her impeccable taste, and Miss Marple recalled seeing her in a green wool coat at the last village fête. Could the button belong to her? The idea seemed improbable. Mrs. Bantry was a pillar of the community, her life an open book, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. She knocked on Mrs. Bantry's door, her face arranged in its usual expression of mild curiosity. "Jane, what a pleasure," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, ushering her inside. The cottage was warm and inviting, with lace curtains and a fire crackling in the hearth. Over tea and scones, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward Grayson. "Such a tragedy," she said, her voice gentle. "Did you know him well, Dolly?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head, her hands smoothing her skirt. "Not really. He came to the fête, made a generous donation, charming but distant somehow." Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation in her voice, the way her eyes flicked to the side. She glanced at the coat rack by the door, where a green wool coat hung, its buttons gleaming in the firelight. They were similar to the one found at the crime scene, but not identical. The rim was gold, not silver. A dead end, perhaps, but Miss Marple filed the observation away as she walked back to her cottage. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the suspects. Clara's argument with Grayson suggested a personal connection, perhaps a promise broken or a secret shared. Tom's jealousy could have driven him to act, but his alibi, corroborated by a neighbor who saw him on his walk, seemed solid. Mrs. Price's financial troubles were compelling, but her loud indignation felt like a performance, a way to distance herself from suspicion. And Stokes, the gardener, was an enigma. His criminal past made him an easy target, but Miss Marple wondered if he was too obvious a choice. The button, she thought, was the key. It belonged to someone who had been in that library, someone who had struggled with Grayson or fled in haste that evening. The village gathered at the pub, the Blue Boar, where the air was thick with the scent. of ale and the hum of conversation. Inspector Craddock was there, nursing a pint as he listened to the villagers' theories. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with a glass of sherry, observed the crowd. Clara and Tom sat at a table near the window, their heads close together, their expressions tense. Mrs. Price held court at the bar, her voice carrying over the din as she recounted her latest theory about a London gang. Stokes was absent, but Miss Marple noted his absence with interest. Was he avoiding scrutiny, or simply keeping to himself? Craddock approached Miss Marple, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Any thoughts, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone half teasing, half respectful. He knew her reputation, her ability to see what others missed. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Only that people are rarely what they seem, Inspector. That button, for instance, it's a small thing, but it tells a story. Find its owner, and you'll find your killer." Chapter 6. Miss Marple's Musings. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, painting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. The room was a picture of quiet order, a small table with a lace doily, a teapot steaming gently, and a basket of knitting resting beside her favorite armchair. Miss Marple sat there now, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. To an outsider, she might have appeared to be daydreaming, lost in the idle thoughts of an elderly spinster. But those who knew her, those few who truly understood the sharp mind behind her gentle demeanor, would have recognized the signs of deep contemplation. The case of Mr. Lionel Grayson's murder weighed heavily on her thoughts. The village of St. Mary Mead was still reeling from the shock of it all. A charismatic stranger, strangled in the grand library of Gossington Hall, his polished facade shattered by a silk scarf tightened around his throat. The police, led by the capable but sometimes overly methodical Inspector Craddock, were bustling about, chasing leads and interrogating suspects. Yet Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay not in the grand gestures or the obvious clues, but in the small, overlooked details, like the single button she had found pitted against the body, a button that did not belong to Grayson's pristine suit. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of her knitting basket, though she made no move to pick up the needles. The button was her anchor, a tiny piece of the puzzle that refused to fit into the neat picture the village wanted to paint. It was made of fine wool, a material too delicate and costly for the everyday coats worn by most of St. Mary Mead's residents. She had seen such fabric before, she was certain, but the memory danced just out of reach, like a name on the tip of her tongue. Her mind, however, was not one to let such details slip away for long. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her movements slow but deliberate, and crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of the room. From a drawer, she retrieved a small notebook, its pages filled with her neat, precise handwriting. She flipped to a fresh page and jotted down a single word, button. Beneath it, she began to list her observations, her pen moving with the steady rhythm of a mind accustomed to unraveling complexities. Button, fine wool, likely from a woman's coat, found near the body, close to the library window. Window, slightly ajar, suggesting the killer may have fled outside. Grayson, polished, charming, but secretive. Why St. Mary Mead? Suspects, Clara, Tom, Mrs. Price, Mr. Stokes, all with motives. None with clear evidence. She paused, tapping the end of her pen against her lips. The button was the key. She was sure of it. It was too specific, too out of place, to be a mere coincidence. Someone had worn a coat into that library. Someone who had struggled with Grayson, perhaps in a moment of desperation or rage. The button had come loose, unnoticed in the chaos, and now it lay in her mind like a pebble in a shoe, demanding attention. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the suspects, each one a thread in the tangled web of St. Mary Mead's social fabric. Clara, the young woman with a fiery temper, had been seen arguing with Grayson just days before his death. Her fiancé Tom was fiercely protective, his jealousy barely concealed beneath his boyish charm. Mrs. Price, the village gossip, had made no secret of her fascination with Grayson's wealth, her eyes gleaming with envy whenever his name was mentioned. And then there was Mr. Stokes, the gardener with a shadowy past, whose sullen demeanor and criminal record made him an easy target for suspicion. But there was another name that lingered in Miss Marple's mind, Mrs. Bantry, the respectable widow, who lived just beyond the village green. Mrs. Bantry was not an official suspect, not yet, but Miss Marple had seen her wearing a coat of fine wool at the church bazaar last month, a coat that might, just might, have a button like the one found in the library. Mrs. Bantry was a pillar of the community, her manners impeccable, her reputation spotless. Yet Miss Marple knew better than most that appearances could be deceiving. She had seen it, time and again. The quiet ones, the ones who seemed above reproach, often hid the darkest secrets. She closed her notebook and returned to her armchair, her eyes drifting to the garden outside. The roses were in full bloom, their petals vibrant against the green of the lawn. It was a peaceful scene, one that belied the turmoil that had gripped St. Mary Mead since Grayson's arrival. Miss Marple allowed her mind to wander, not aimlessly, but with purpose, letting the pieces of the puzzle shift and settle like tiles in a mosaic. Grayson had been a man of contradictions. His charm was undeniable. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had called him positively magnetic at the tea party last week. But there was a hardness in his eyes, a calculated edge to his smiles. He had rented Gossington Hall with a flourish, arriving in a sleek car that had turned heads in the village. He spoke of business ventures in London, of investments and opportunities, but he was vague about the details. Miss Marple had noticed that vagueness, just as she had noticed the way his gaze lingered on certain villagers, as if assessing their worth. She thought back to the tea party, where the village had gathered to dissect Grayson's arrival. Mrs. Price had been particularly vocal, her voice shrill as she speculated about his wealth. "He must be worth a fortune," she had said, her teacup rattling in its saucer. "Why else would he take Gossington Hall? It's far too grand for a bachelor." Clara, sitting nearby, had been quieter, her eyes downcast, but Miss Marple had seen the flush in her cheeks when Grayson's name was mentioned. Tom, ever watchful, had kept his arm around her, his jaw tight. Miss Marple's fingers twitched as if itching to pick up her knitting. Instead, she reached for her thaw button, which she had carefully wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked into a small tin on her side table. She unwrapped it now, holding it up to the light. The wool was a deep navy, almost black, with a subtle sheen that spoke of quality. She turned it over, noting the tiny stitches that had once secured it to its garment. It was a small thing, insignificant to most, but to Miss Marple It was a thread that could unravel the entire mystery. She thought of Mrs. Bantry again, picturing the widow's coat in her mind. It had been a handsome garment, tailored and elegant, the kind of coat that suggested both taste and means. But was it the same wool? Miss Marple couldn't be certain, not yet. She would need to see the coat again, perhaps at the village dance. Tomorrow night, where the whole of St. Mary Mead would gather to celebrate the harvest. It would be the perfect opportunity to observe, to listen, to let the villagers reveal themselves in their unguarded moments. Her mind drifted to Clara and Tom, the young couple who seemed so devoted yet so troubled. Clara was a bright girl, full of spirit, but there was a shadow in her eyes, a nervousness that Miss Marple had seen before in those who carried secrets. Tom, too, was uneasy, his protectiveness bordering on possessiveness. At the tea party, Miss Marple had overheard a snatch of their conversation, a whispered exchange about a promise Grayson had made. What had he promised, and to whom? Was it a promise of love, of money, or something darker? Then there was Mr. Stokes, the gardener, whose rough hands and guarded demeanor made him an outsider in the village. Inspector Craddock had been quick to point to Stokes's criminal recorder theft charge from years ago, but Miss Marple was not so easily convinced. Stokes was surly, yes, but there was a quiet dignity in his work, a care in the way he tended the gardens of Gossington Hall. Could such a man commit murder? Or was he simply an easy scapegoat, a convenient target for a village eager to close the case? Miss Marple sighed softly, her gaze returning to the button. The answer was there, she was certain, hidden in the fabric of St. Mary Mead itself. She thought of the village as a tapestry, each resident a thread woven into the whole. Grayson's arrival had tugged at those threads, loosening some, tightening others, until one had snapped, leaving a button behind as evidence of the break. She rose again, this time to make herself a cup of tea. As the kettle boiled, she let her thoughts wander further, considering the crime scene itself. The library at Gossington Hall was a grand room, its shelves lined with leather-bound books, its windows overlooking the sprawling gardens. The window nearest the body had been slightly ajar, a detail Inspector Craddock had dismissed as irrelevant. But Miss Marple was not so quick to overlook it. Had the killer entered through the window or fled through it? The button had been found nearby, suggesting a struggle near the glass. Perhaps as the killer made their escape, she poured the tea, the steam rising in delicate curls, and settled back into her chair. Her mind turned to Grayson's past, which was as murky as the tea leaves at the bottom of her cup. Her nephew, Raymond West, had promised to look into Grayson's history, using his connections in London to dig up whatever he could. Miss Marple had no doubt that Grayson was not what he seemed, a swindler, perhaps, or a man running from his past. Such men often brought trouble with them, and St. Mary Mead, for all its quiet charm, was not immune to the shadows they cast. S. She sipped her tea. Miss Marple considered the alibis. Inspector Craddock had been thorough, questioning each suspect about their whereabouts on the night of the murder. Clara had been at home, she claimed, though her mother, Mrs. Langley, had been vague about the details. Chapter 7. A Hidden Past. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the window of her neat little cottage in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. Outside, the village was stirring. Mrs. Price was already bustling toward the post office, no doubt eager to share the latest gossip about the shocking murder of Mr. Lionel Grayson at Gossington Hall. The village was abuzz, and Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human nature, was quietly piecing together the puzzle that had unsettled the tranquil community. The discovery of Grayson's body in the library, strangled with a silk scarf, had sent ripples of unease through St. Mary Mead. The police, under Inspector Craddock's diligent but somewhat predictable leadership. But Miss Marple, who had seen the crime scene during a discreet visit with Mrs. Bantry, knew better. The scene felt staged, too carefully arranged to be the work of a panicked thief. And then there was the button, a single, small, woolen button, found near the body, pitted against the polished floorboards. It didn't match Grayson's tailored suit, nor did it belong to the silk scarf used in the crime. It was a clue, a tiny thread in the tapestry of deceit, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it. She set her knitting aside and sipped her tea, her mind turning over the button's significance. It was made of fine wool, suggesting a garment of quality, perhaps a woman's coat, but whose? The question had nagged at her since she first heard Inspector Craddock mention it, almost dismissively, as he catalogued the crime scene evidence. Miss Marple had a habit of noticing what others overlooked, and this button, with its subtle sheen and sturdy stitching, was no ordinary trifle. It was a whisper of truth in a village full of murmurs. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, adjusting her shawl as she rose. The door creaked open, and her nephew, Raymond West, stepped inside, his city polish slightly at odds with the cozy simplicity of the cottage. Raymond, a writer with a penchant for dramatic flair, was fond of his aunt's quiet wisdom, though he often underestimated its depth. "Good morning, Aunt Jane," he said, brushing a speck of lint from his jacket. "I hope I'm not interrupting your knitting." "Well, some of your usual insights." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "You make it sound as though I'm always meddling, Raymond. I've been thinking about Mr. Grayson, our mysterious newcomer. There's more to him than meets the eye, I suspect." Raymond raised an eyebrow, settling into a chair opposite her. "You think so?" He seemed a charming sort, if a bit too smooth. Half the village was half in love with him, and the other half wanted his money. But a murderer, that's a leap, even for St. Mary Mead. "Not a murderer, Raymond," Miss Marple corrected gently. "A victim. And victims, you see, often have secrets that make others want to harm them. I'd like to know more about Mr. Grayson's past, where he came from, what he did before he arrived here with his polished manners and rented grandeur." Raymond leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "You think he was hiding something? Well, I suppose I could make a few inquiries. I have contacts in London, journalists, old school chums, that sort of thing. What exactly are you looking for?" Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, the needles moving with a rhythm that belied the sharpness of her mind. "Anything at all, my dear. Business dealings, old acquaintances, scandals, anything that might explain why someone in St. Mary Mead would want him dead. And do be discreet, Raymond. We don't want to stir up more gossip than necessary." Raymond grinned, clapping his hands together. "A mission. I'll get on it right away, Aunt Jane. But don't expect me a writer, not a detective." "You'll do splendidly," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but firm. And do let me know what you find, won't you? Even the smallest detail might be important. As Raymond left, promising to telephone with any news, Miss Marple returned to her thoughts. Grayson's arrival in St. Mary Mead had been like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through the village's quiet routines. He had rented Gossington Hall, a grand estate that had stood empty since the Bantrys' financial troubles forced them to downsize. His charm had won over many. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had called him delightfully worldly, and even the usually skeptical Mrs. Price had been seen blushing at his compliments. But Miss Marple, who had seen many charming newcomers in her time, had noticed something else, a guardedness in his eyes, a too-perfect smile that didn't quite reach them. He was playing a part, she was sure of it, and the button was a clue. Where she kept a small notebook for jotting down her thoughts. Opening it to a fresh page, she wrote, "Button fine wool, woman's coat, found near window, Grayson strangled, staged scene, possible blackmail." She paused, tapping her pencil against her lips. Blackmail was a common motive in her experience, and Grayson's wealth and mysterious past made it a plausible one. If he had been threatening to expose someone's secret, it would explain the desperation behind the murder. But whose secret? And how did the button fit in? The afternoon passed quietly, with Miss Marple tending to her garden and exchanging pleasantries with passersby. But her mind was far from idle. She recalled the tea party at Mrs. Bantry's, where the village had gathered to dissect Grayson's death. Mrs. Price had been particularly vocal, hinting that Grayson had been seen with Clara, the young woman, engaged to Tom in what she called compromising circumstances. Clara had blushed furiously, denying any impropriety, while Tom had glowered silently. Mrs. Bantry, ever the gracious hostess, had steered the conversation elsewhere, but Miss Marple had noticed her discomfort. By evening, Raymond telephoned with news. "Aunt Jane, you were right to suspect Grayson wasn't what he seemed," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "Turns out Grayson, or rather, Leonard Gray, as he was known 10 years ago, was involved in some shady dealings in London. Embezzlement, fraud, that sort of thing. He vanished after a scandal, and no one knew where he'd gone until he popped up here." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Leonard Gray, you say? And what sort of scandal?" "Something about swindling investors out of thousands," Raymond replied. "He was never convicted. Too clever for that, but he made enemies. My friend says he changed his name and disappeared to avoid creditors. There's talk he might have been blackmailing some of his old associates, though nothing was ever proven." "Blackmail," Miss Marple murmured, her suspicions confirmed. "That's very interesting, Raymond. Did your friend mention any names, anyone who might have crossed paths with him here?" "Not specifically," Raymond admitted, "but I did find out he spent time in Bristol before coming to St. Mary Mead. There's a chance he knew someone from there, maybe someone who followed him here. I'll keep digging, but it's tricky without raising suspicions." "You've done very well, Raymond," Miss Marple said. "Do keep me posted, and please be careful. If Mr. Grayson was indeed blackmailing someone, they may not take kindly to inquiries. Leonard Gray, a swindler who had reinvented himself as Lionel Grayson, charming newcomer. If he had been blackmailing someone in St. Mary Mead, it would explain the murder and the button. Perhaps the killer had been someone he knew from his past, someone whose secret he threatened to expose. But who in the village had a connection to Bristol, or to Grayson's former life? She thought of the suspects Inspector Craddock had mentioned, Clara, who had argued with Grayson, Tom, her protective fiancée, Mrs. Price, whose greed was no secret, and Mr. Stokes, the gardener, with a criminal record. Stokes, in particular, intrigued her. He was a rough sort, with a scar across his cheek and a tendency to keep to himself. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned he'd worked in Bristol before coming to St. Mary Mead. A coincidence that now seemed significant. Could he have known Grayson in his previous life? Stokes was unlikely to own a fine wool coat, but perhaps he was protecting someone else. Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Gossington Hall the next morning. Mrs. Bantry, who still had access to the estate as a courtesy from the new owners, had offered to show her around, and Miss Marple intended to take a closer look at the library. The button had been found near the window, suggesting the killer had fled that way. But why leave such a clue behind? Had it been an accident, or was it meant to mislead? The next day dawned crisp and clear, and Miss Marple made her way to Guise Hall, her black umbrella tucked under her arm despite the fine weather. Mrs. Bantry greeted her warmly, her cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the grim events that had unfolded in her former home. Chapter 8. The Alibi Puzzle. The morning after the shocking discovery of Mr. Lionel Grayson's body in the library of Gossington Hall, St. Mary Mead buzzed with a nervous energy that seemed to hum through its cobblestone lanes and ivy-clad cottages. The village, usually a haven of quiet routinistes at 4, gossip over garden fences, and the rhythmic clatter of milk bottles at dawn, had been shaken to its core. The news of Grayson's murder spread like wildfire, fanned by whispers in the post office and hushed conversations at the Blue Boar Inn. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock and his team had set up a makeshift headquarters in the village hall, a squat stone building that usually hosted flower shows and amateur dramatics. The inspector, a man of methodical habits and a no-nonsense demeanor, was determined to crack the case quickly. But the villagers' tangled web of alibis was proving to be a formidable puzzle. Miss Jane Marple, sitting in her neat parlor with its chintz curtains and polished mahogany table, sipped her morning tea and considered the events of the past 24 hours. Her sharp eyes, framed by delicate spectacles, missed nothing, not the way the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had hesitated when asked about her whereabouts the previous evening, nor the curious absence of a single button from the crime scene, a detail the police had overlooked but which Miss Marple had tucked away in her mind like a stray thread in her knitting basket. The button, small and unassuming, was made of fine wool and bore the faint trace of a woman's coat. It was the sort of clue that most would dismiss, but to Miss Marple it was a loose stitch in the fabric of the murderer's guise, waiting to be pulled. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, was methodically working through his list of suspects. His notebook, a battered, leather-bound affair, was filled with neat columns of names, motives, and alibis, each entry written in his precise, angular handwriting. The suspects were a motley crew, drawn from the village's eclectic cast of characters, each with a potential reason to wish Grayson harm. Clara Langley, the young woman who had been seen arguing with Grayson 2 days before his death, was at the top of the list. Her fiery temper and whispered connection to the charming newcomer had raised eyebrows. Then there was Tom Harper, Clara's fiancé, whose jealousy was as plain as the flush on his face whenever Grayson's name was mentioned. Mrs. Price, The village's self-appointed gossip-monger had made no secret of her envy of Grayson. Apparent wealth, her sharp tongue cutting through his charm like a knife through butter. And finally, there was Mr. Stokes, the gardener at Gossington Hall, a man with a shadowed past and a criminal record that Craddock had unearthed with a single telephone call to Scotland Yard. The inspector's first stop that morning was Clara Langley's cottage, a quaint, rose-covered dwelling on the edge of the village green. Clara, a slender young woman with auburn hair and a nervous habit of twisting her hands, opened the door with a look of apprehension. Her eyes, red-rimmed from lack of sleep, darted to the constable standing behind Craddock before settling on the inspector's calm, professional gaze. "Good morning, Miss Langley," Craddock said, tipping his hat. "May we come in? We'd like to ask you a few questions about Mr. Grayson." Clara nodded, stepping aside to let them into the small parlor. The room was tidy but modest, with a worn rug and a vase of wilting daisies on the mantelpiece. She gestured to a pair of armchairs, and Craddock sat, flipping open his notebook. The constable, a young man named Harris, stood by the door, his pencil poised over his own notepad. "I've already told you everything I know," Clara said, her voice tight. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Witnesses saw you arguing with him outside the post office on Tuesday. Care to explain what that was about?" Clara's cheeks flushed, and she twisted her hands again, the knuckles whitening. "It was nothing serious. He made a comment about my dress, said it was old-fashioned. I told him to mind his own business, that's all." Craddock jotted down her words, his face impassive. "And where were you on Wednesday evening, between 8 and 10 o'clock?" "I was here," Clara said quickly. "Tom came over after supper, and we played cards until nearly midnight. You can ask him." "We will," Craddock said, making another note. "Did anyone else see you that evening?" Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering to the window. "No, just Tom." Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. "Thank you, Miss Langley. We'll be in touch." As the inspector and his constable left the cottage, Craddock's mind was already turning over Clara's words. Her alibi depended entirely on Tom Harper, a man whose devotion to her was matched only by his quick temper. If Tom was covering for her, or if they were both involved, the case could be more complex than a simple robbery gone wrong. Craddock's next stop was Tom's workshop, a cluttered shed behind the village blacksmith's forge, where the young man was hammering out a horseshoe with more force than necessary. "Mr. Harper," Craddock called, stepping into the dim, smoky space. Tom looked up, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve. His broad shoulders and calloused hands spoke of hard work, but his eyes held a wariness that Craddock noted immediately. "What do you want?" Tom asked, setting down his hammer. "Just a few questions," Craddock said, his tone even. "Can you confirm where you were Wednesday evening?" Tom's jaw tightened. "I was with Clara at her cottage." "She told you that already, didn't she?" "She did," Craddock said, "but I'd like to hear it from you. Anyone else see you there?" Tom shook his head. "No, it was just us." Craddock made a note, his pen scratching softly. "And what was your relationship with Mr. Grayson?" "No relationship," Tom said curtly. "He was a stranger, kept to himself, mostly." "Yet you didn't like him," Craddock pressed. "Witnesses say you glared at him whenever he was near." "Clara." Tom's hands clenched into fists, but he forced a shrug. "He was too smooth, always talking to her, making her laugh. I didn't trust him, but I didn't kill him. if that's what you're thinking. Craddock studied Tom's face for a moment before nodding. We'll speak again, Mr. Harper. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple was piecing together her own version of the puzzle. She sat in her favorite armchair, a ball of pale blue wool in her lap, and her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. Her mind, however, was far from the scarf she was creating. She was thinking about the button, that small, innocuous object that had caught her eye in the library. It was made of fine wool, the sort used in expensive coats, and it bore a distinctive pattern, a tiny embroidered flower that suggested it belonged to someone of taste, if not wealth. The police had dismissed it as irrelevant, assuming it had been dropped by a guest at one of Grayson's lavish parties, but Miss Marple was not so sure. She had seen a coat with similar buttons recently, though the memory was elusive. Like a name on the tip of her tongue, she set her knitting aside and reached for her notebook, a small, leather-bound volume where she jotted down her observations. Flipping to a fresh page, she wrote, "Button fine wool, embroidered flower, found near window, woman's coat." She paused, tapping the pencil against her lips. The window was key. The library at Gossington Hall had tall, mullioned windows that opened onto a terrace, and beyond that, a garden that sloped down to a low stone wall. If the killer had fled through the window, the button might have been torn off in their haste. But whose coat was it, and why had no one reported it missing? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, her round face flushed with excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? The police are questioning everyone. They've just been to see Clara Langley, and now they're at Tom Harper's workshop. Do you think one of them did it?" Miss Marple smiled, gesturing for Mrs. Clement to sit. "The police are doing their job, my dear. But tell me, what do you know about Clara and Tom? Were they close to Mr. Grayson?" Mrs. Clement leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Clara was quite taken with him, you know. He had a way of making people feel special, especially young women. Tom didn't like it one bit. I saw him storm out of the Blue Boar last week after Grayson bought Clara a drink." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what about Mrs. Price? She seemed to have strong opinions about Mr. Grayson." Mrs. Clement snorted. "Oh, she was green with envy. Always going on about his fancy car and his big house. Said he was too good to be true. And you know how she loves to be right." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information. "And Mr. Stokes, the gardener, did he ever mention Mr. Grayson?" Mrs. Clement frowned. "Not much. He's a quiet one. Stokes keeps to himself. But I heard he was in trouble years ago, something about theft. Do you think he could have done it?" "It's too early to say," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But I'm sure the inspector will find out." After Mrs. Clement left, Miss Marple returned to her notebook. She added, "Claire argument. With Grayson, Tom jealous, Mrs. Price envious, Stokes' criminal past. Each suspect had a motive, but the alibis were the sticking point. Clara and Tom vouched for each other, which was convenient but not airtight. Mrs. Price claimed to have been at home with her husband, a meek man who rarely contradicted her, and Stokes had said he was in his shed at the edge of the village, alone, which was no alibi at all. Chapter 9. The Village Dance. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp bite. The annual St. Mary Mead dance, a cherished tradition, had drawn nearly every soul in the village to the polished wooden floors of the hall, where laughter and music mingled with the scent of polished oak and homemade punch. The hall itself was a modest affair, with whitewashed walls adorned with bunting in cheerful reds and blues, and long tables laden with scones, sandwiches. The banda local trio of fiddle, accordion, and piano played a lively reel, and couples, young and old, swirled in patterns that spoke of years of practice. Miss Jane Marple sat in a cushioned chair near the edge of the dance floor, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Her eyes, bright and sharp behind her spectacles, took in the scene with the quiet intensity of a hawk surveying a field. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying the festivities, her hands busy with a half-finished shawl of pale blue wool. But beneath her placid exterior, her mind was a whirl of observation. Though the villagers did their best to mask their unease with forced gaiety, had left a shadow over St. Mary Mead, and the dance was as much a distraction as it was a celebration. Miss Marple noted the way conversations faltered when Grayson's name was mentioned. Her fiancé, Tom Reynolds, whose jealousy was no secret, Mrs. Price, the village gossip with a greedy streak, and Mr. Stokes, the gardener with a shadowed past. Each moved through the crowd, their faces a mix of defiance and discomfort. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Clara, who stood near the punch table, her auburn curls catching the lantern light. She wore a green dress that hugged her slender frame, and her fingers twisted nervously around a glass of punch she hadn't touched. Tom stood beside her, his broad shoulders stiff, his jaw set as he scanned the room. Their conversation was hushed, but Miss Marple's sharp ears caught fragments something about a promise Grayson had made. The word piqued her interest. Promises, in her experience, were often the threads that bound motives to actions. Mrs. Price held court near the dessert table, her voice carrying over the music as she regaled a group of women with tales of Grayson's supposed wealth. Her graying hair was pinned tightly, and her eyes gleamed with the thrill of gossip. Miss Marple noted the way Mrs. Price's hands fluttered, as if she were performing rather than conversing, a hint of triumph that suggested she knew more than she let on. Lurked near the hall's entrance, his rough hands shoved into the pockets of a worn jacket. Miss Marple had seen men like Stokes before, men whose pasts clung to them like damp earth, and she wondered what secrets he carried from his days beyond St. Mary Mead. But it was Mrs. Bantry who drew Miss Marple's attention most keenly. The widow, a pillar of respectability, moved through the crowd with her usual grace. She wore a navy coat over her dress, its fine wool catching the light. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the coat. It was similar to the one she'd associated with the button found at the crime scene, a button of fine wool. But as Mrs. Bantry turned, Miss Marple saw the buttons on her coat were all accounted for, and their design was subtly different. Polished brass, not the carved bone of the clue. She filed this observation away, her mind turning over the possibility that the button belonged to someone else entirely. The music shifted to a slower waltz, and the crowd parted to allow couples to pair off. Onto the floor, his hand firm on her waist. Their movements were stiff, lacking the ease of lovers, and Clara's eyes kept darting toward the hall's windows, as if expecting to see someone outside. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting. Clara's nervousness was palpable, and it reminded her of a young woman she'd known years ago, caught in a web of her own making. "Lovely evening, isn't it, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, settled into the chair beside her, her cheeks flushed from dancing. Her dress, a practical shade of brown, was adorned with a brooch that glinted in the lantern light. "Though I dare say the village is still rattled." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft. "It's curious how tragedy brings out so many stories, don't you think? Everyone seems to have a theory about Mr. Grayson." Mrs. Clement leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, yes. Mrs. Price swears he was a millionaire hiding from creditors, but young Clara told me he was some sort of artist. And then there's Mr. Stokes, who, well, you know how people talk about his time in prison." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes still on the dance floor. "People do love to talk, but it's the small things, Mrs. Clement, that often tell the truest stories. A word, a glance, a misplaced button." Mrs. Clement's brow furrowed. "A button? Oh, you mean that little thing the police found. I heard it was nothing important, just something Grayson might have picked up," said her tone non-committal. She had no intention of sharing her suspicions just yet. The button, with its fine wool and carved bone, was a puzzle piece that didn't yet fit. But she was certain it held the key to Grayson's murder. Her mind drifted to Mrs. Langley, Clara's mother, a quiet widow who had claimed to barely know Grayson. Miss Marple recalled the faint scent of lavender perfume near the crime scene, scent she associated with Mrs. Langley's presence at the village shop. It was a tenuous thread, but Miss Marple was accustomed to weaving such threads into tapestries of truth. The dance continued, the music swelling as the band launched into a spirited polka. Miss Marple's eyes followed Mrs. Bantry, who had joined the vicar in a lively turn across the floor. Her coat was now draped over a chair, and Miss Marple noted the care with which she'd folded it. Mrs. Bantry was not the sort to lose a button carelessly, yet the possibility lingered that someone else in the village owned a similar coat or had borrowed one to deflect suspicion. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind working through the web of motives and alibis. Grayson had been a swindler, according to her nephew Raymond's discreet inquiries. A man who changed identities as easily as others changed coats. He had likely come to St. Mary Mead to escape his past, but pasts had a way of catching up, especially when blackmail was involved. Miss Marple considered the suspects. Clara, whose argument with Grayson suggested a personal grievance. Tom, whose jealousy could have turned violent. Mrs. Price, whose greed might have driven her to desperate measures. And Stokes, whose criminal history made him an easy target for suspicion. But it was Mrs. Langley who nagged at her thoughts. A woman whose quiet demeanor hid a strength Miss Marple had seen in others who acted to protect their own. The band paused, and the dancers dispersed to catch their breath. Miss Marple seized the moment to approach Clara, who stood alone near a window, her face pale. "Enjoying the dance, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle. Clara started, her hand tightening around her glass. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes. It's lovely. Just a bit overwhelming." "You seem troubled. It's been a difficult week for the village, hasn't it? Mr. Grayson's death has stirred up so many questions." Clara's lips parted, then closed. "I didn't know him well," she said quickly. "He was kind, but—" She trailed off, her eyes flicking toward Tom, who was speaking with the vicar across the room. Miss Marple nodded. as if satisfied, but her mind latched onto Clara's hesitation. There was a secret there, one tied to the promise she'd overheard. She made a mental note to speak with Tom later, to gauge his temper and his loyalty to Clara. As she returned to her seat, Miss Marple caught sight of Stokes slipping out the hall's side door. His movements were furtive, and she recalled the way he'd lingered near her cottage the previous evening, as if watching for something. She wondered if he was merely curious or if he feared exposure. To Titan, she had asked the vicar's wife to mention the witness casually at the dance, knowing it would spread like wildfire. If the killer was among them, they might act rashly, revealing themselves. The evening drew to a close, the band playing a final waltz as the villagers began to drift homeward. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and stepped into the cool night air, her mind alive with possibilities. The button, the perfume, the whispered promisal were threads in a tapestry she was beginning to understand. As she walked the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, her footsteps soft on the cobblestones. Chapter 10. A dangerous trap. The village hall of St. Mary Mead glowed with the warm flicker of lanterns, their soft light spilling across the polished wooden floor. The annual village dance was in full swing, a cherished tradition that drew every soul from the cobblestoned lanes to the grand estates. Streamers of red and gold draped the rafters, and the air hummed with the lively strains of a local quartet, their fiddles and piano weaving a merry tune. Laughter and chatter mingled with the clink of glasses as villagers swirled in pairs or clustered in gossiping knots. Yet, beneath the festive veneer, a quiet tension simmered, and Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, felt it keenly. Her sharp eyes, half hidden behind spectacles, darted across the room. She wore her usual attire, a soft lavender dress, a cameo brooch pinned neatly at her collar, and a light shawl draped over her shoulders. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying the evening, her needles clicking rhythmically. But Miss Marple was anything but idle. Her mind churned, piecing together the puzzle of Mr. Lionel Grayson's murder. With that single, curious button at its heart, the dance floor was a kaleidoscope of movement. Clara Langley, in a pale blue frock, spun in the arms of her fiancé. Tom Harper, whose broad shoulders and easy smile masked a flicker of unease. Mrs. Price, resplendent in a garish green gown, held court near the punch bowl, her voice carrying over the music as she regaled the group with tales of Grayson's supposed wealth. Mrs. Bantry, elegant in a deep burgundy dress, chatted with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, her coat draped over a cherry-coat. Miss Marple noted that bore buttons of polished brass, not the fine wool button found at the crime scene. And then there was Mr. Stokes, the gardener, lurking near the door, his weathered face half-shadowed, his eyes scanning the crowd with a wariness that pricked Miss Marple's curiosity. She had been turning over the facts in her mind all day, like a gardener sifting soil. The button, found near Grayson's body in the library of Gossington Hall, was no mere trifle. It was a woman's button, from a coat of fine wool, pitted and scratched, as if it had been torn off in a struggle. It didn't belong to Grayson, nor to any garment in the room. Its presence near the window suggested the killer had fled outside, perhaps in haste. But whose coat? Mrs. Bantry's coat had caught her eye earlier, but its buttons were wrong. Clara's nervous glances, Tom's protective hovering, Mrs. Price's greedy interest in Grayson's fortunes, and Stokes's shadowy pastol were threads in the tapestry, but none yet wove into a clear picture. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by Mrs. Clement, who bustled over, her cheeks flushed from dancing. "Jane, you must join us for a turn," she exclaimed, her eyes bright. "It's such a lovely evening, isn't it? Though I dare say the talk is all about poor Mr. Grayson. Such a dreadful business." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing. "Indeed, Margaret, the village is quite stirred. Have you heard anything new?" Mrs. Clement leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Only that Inspector Craddock's been asking questions again. He was at the vicarage this morning, wanting to know about Clara and Tom. And Mrs. Price swears she saw Stokes near Gossington Hall the night of the murder, though she's always one for a story." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. People do love to talk. It's often in the smallest details that the truth hides, don't you think? Mrs. Clement blinked, then laughed. "Oh, Jane, you and your notions. You should tell that to the inspector." She patted Miss Marple's arm and drifted back to the dance floor, leaving the older woman to her thoughts. The idea had come to Miss Marple that morning, as she sipped tea in her cottage, the button resting on her table like a silent challenge. The killer was still among them, hiding behind a carefully crafted facade. To unmask them, she needed to unsettle their confidence, to force a misstep, a trap, subtle and precise, was required. She had turned to Mrs. Clement earlier that day, knowing the vicar's wife was the hub of village gossip, over a cup of Darjeeling. Miss Marple had planted a seed. "Margaret," she had said, her tone casual, "I heard from Dolly Bantry that the police may have found a witness to Mr. Grayson's murder. Someone who saw something that night, near Gossington Hall, but it's all very hush-hush." Mrs. Clement's eyes had widened, her teacup clattering against its saucer. "A witness? Oh, Jane, you don't say. Who could it be?" Miss Marple had shrugged delicately. "I'm sure I don't know, but I imagine the police are keeping it quiet to protect them. It's bound to come out soon, though. By now, the rumor would be spreading like wildfire, fanned by Mrs. Clement's eager tongue. The killer, if they heard it, might grow nervous, fearing exposure. A nervous person, Miss Marple knew, was prone to mistakes, and so she watched the dance, waiting for a sign. The music shifted to a slower waltz, and Miss Marple's gaze settled on Clara and Tom. Clara's smile was strained, her hand clutching Tom's arm a fraction too tightly. Tom leaned down, whispering something, and Clara's eyes darted toward the door where Stokes stood. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. Was Clara afraid of Stokes? Or was it something else, something tied to Grayson's promise, a phrase she had overheard them whisper earlier? She recalled the tea party at Mrs. Price's, where Clara had spoken of Grayson in a trembling voice, saying he had promised her a way out. A way out of what? Poverty? A secret? Miss Marple's nephew, Raymond West, had uncovered Grayson's past as a swindler, a man who thrived on others' weaknesses. Had he been manipulating Clara, perhaps threatening to expose something about her or Tom? Or was it someone closer, someone like Clara's mother, Mrs. Langley, whose quiet demeanor hid a nervous edge? Mrs. Bantry approached, her coat now over her arm, and sank into a chair beside Miss Marple. "Jane, you're missing all the fun," she said, fanning herself. "Though I must say, This murder has everyone on edge. I heard from Mrs. Clement. There's a witness. Now, can you imagine?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "The village does love its stories, Dolly. But a witness could change everything, couldn't it?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, her gaze drifting to the dance floor. "It's unsettling, thinking the killer might be here, dancing among us. I keep thinking about that button you mentioned. Such a queer thing to find." Miss Marple's fingers stilled. She had mentioned the button to Mrs. Bantry in passing, testing her reaction, but the older woman had seemed genuinely puzzled. The brass buttons on her coat gleamed under the lantern light, nothing like the woolen one from the crime scene. "It is curious," Miss Marple agreed. "Buttons can tell such stories if one knows how to listen." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "You and your buttons, Jane. You'll solve this case before Craddock, mark my words." As Mrs. Bantry rejoined the dancers, Miss Marple's attention shifted to Stokes. The gardener had moved to the edge of the hall, his hands in his pockets, his posture tense. He was watching Clara and Tom, his eyes narrowing. Miss Marple frowned. Stokes had a criminal record petty theft years ago, but his behavior suggested more than idle curiosity. Had he been at Gossington Hall that night, as Mrs. Price claimed, or was he merely a convenient scapegoat, his rough appearance making him an easy target for suspicion? The music paused, and the dancers clapped, catching their breath. Miss Marple seized the moment to rise, tucking her knitting into her bag. She moved toward the refreshment table, where Mrs. Price was holding forth, her voice shrill and, "I said to Mr. Price that Stokes is trouble. I saw him skulking near the hall the very night it happened. He's got those shifty eyes, you know." Miss Marple sipped her punch, listening. Mrs. Price's story was vivid, but her details shifted. With each retelling, yesterday she had claimed to see Stokes at dusk. Today it was midnight. Such inconsistencies, Miss Marple thought, were telling. Was Mrs. Price inventing a tale to deflect suspicion, perhaps from herself? Her greed for Grayson's supposed wealth was no secret. "Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said mildly, "you have such a keen eye. Did you notice anything else that night? A woman's coat, perhaps, near the hall?" Mrs. Price blinked, caught off guard. "A coat? Well, I know. I don't think so. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just a passing thought," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "One hears such odd things." She moved away, her mind racing. Mrs. Price's hesitation was intriguing, but it was Clara who drew her focus now. The young woman stood alone near a window, her face pale. Tom was across the room, talking to the vicar, leaving Clara momentarily unguarded. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft. "Clara, my dear," she said gently, "you look troubled." "Is everything all right?" Clara started, her hand fluttering to her throat. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's just the dance. All this talk about Mr. Grayson. It's overwhelming." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It's a trying time. I couldn't help overhearing you and Tom earlier about a promise Mr. Grayson made. It sounded important." Clara's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing her face. "It was nothing," she said quickly, "just business. He said he could help us, but it didn't work out." "I see," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "He was a charming man, wasn't he? But charm can hide so much." Clara swallowed, her gaze darting to Tom. "Yes," she whispered. "He was persuasive." Chapter 11. The clue unravels the morning sun, filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a ball of soft gray wool in her lap, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as her mind worked through the puzzle of Mr. Lionel Grayson's murder. The single button, small and unassuming, lay on the side table beside her, its fine woolen texture catching the light form of the charming newcomer. Now, after days of quiet observation and careful deduction, she was certain the button belonged to a coat owned by Mrs. Langley, Clara's mother, a woman who had presented herself as a quiet, unremarkable widow. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances in St. Mary Mead. The village had been restless since the murder. Was he a wealthy businessman, as he claimed, or a swindler hiding behind a polished facade? The police, under Inspector Craddock's steady hand, had combed through the evidence, interviewed suspects, and chased alibis, but they were no closer to the truth. The button, however, had spoken to Miss Marple in a way no witness statement could. Its presence near the library window, far from Grayson's tailored suit, suggested a struggle, a fleeting escape, and a killer who was not as careful as they believed. Mrs. Langley's coat, made of fine wool and adorned with buttons of the same distinctive weave, was the key. But Miss Marple needed more than a hunch, needed proof, and she needed Mrs. Langley to reveal herself. The old lady sat, her knitting aside, and rose, smoothing her skirt. She crossed the room to her writing desk, where a small notebook lay open, filled with her neat, precise handwriting. She had jotted down every detail: the button's placement, the faint scent of lavender perfume near the crime scene, Mrs. Langley's nervous fidgeting at the village dance, and the whispered conversation between Clara and Tom about a promise Grayson had made. Each piece was a thread in the tapestry of deceit, and Miss Marple was determined to weave them together. She glanced out the window at the garden, where her roses bloomed in orderly rows. The sight always calmed her, reminding her that even the most tangled mysteries could be unraveled with patience. Mrs. Langley had claimed to barely know Grayson, but Miss Marple had seen the flicker of fear in her eyes when his name was mentioned. There was a connection, one that went beyond casual acquaintance. Her nephew Raymond's inquiries had confirmed Grayson's past as a swindler, a man who changed identities as easily as others changed coats. Could he have known Mrs. Langley from another time, another place? Could he have been blackmailing her, as he had others in St. Mary Mead? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, her face flushed with the excitement of delivering news. "Jane, you won't believe it," she began, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "The village is buzzing. They say the police have found a witness to the murderer boy who saw someone running from Gossington Hall that night." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. The rumor was her own creation, a subtle trap set through Mrs. Clement's unwitting gossip. She had asked the vicar's wife to spread the story, knowing it would reach the killer's ears and stir them into action. Hands fluttering. "Well, no one knows who the boy is, but they say he saw a figure in a dark coat fleeing through the garden. The police are questioning everyone again, and poor Clara is beside herself. She was at the vicarage this morning, looking pale as a ghost." "Clara is a sensitive girl," Miss Marple said, her mind already turning. Clara's nervousness was no surprise. She was entangled in the mystery, though Miss Marple suspected not as the killer. The real question was Mrs. Langley. Had the rumor rattled her? Would she make a mistake? After Mrs. Clement left, promising to return with more news, Miss Marple decided it was time to act. She would invite Mrs. Langley for tea, a setting so innocuous that no one could suspect her intentions. She penned a brief note, her handwriting as delicate as her plan. "Dear Mrs. Langley, I should be delighted if you could join me for tea this afternoon at 4 o'clock. I have some lovely new biscuits from the bakery, and I'd so enjoy your company. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple." She sealed the envelope and handed it to her maid, Lily, with instructions to deliver it to Mrs. Langley's cottage. Then she set about arranging a tray with her best china teacups and a plate of shortbread biscuits. The setting was perfect, cozy, familiar, disarming. If Mrs. Langley was hiding a secret, Miss Marple's quiet probing would uncover it. At precisely 4 o'clock, Mrs. Langley arrived. She was a slight woman in her late 50s, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes wary behind a polite smile. She wore a plain dress and a light shawl, not the woolen coat Miss Marple had seen her in before, but the absence of the coat was telling in itself. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to invite me," she said, her voice steady but her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied, gesturing to a chair. "It's always a pleasure to have a chat. Do sit down." They exchanged pleasantries as Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate and calm. She spoke of the weather, the roses, and the upcoming church fete, watching Mrs. Langley's reactions. The widow nodded politely, but her eyes darted to the window, as if expecting someone to appear. Miss Marple let the conversation drift, allowing the silence to settle like dust. "I was so sorry to hear about Mr. Grayson," she said at last, her tone gentle. "Such a shocking thing for our little village. Did you know him well?" Mrs. Langley's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "Not really," she said quickly. "We spoke a few times, at the shops or the post office. He was charming, I suppose." "Charming, yes," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Langley's face. "But one does wonder about his past. So many secrets in a man like that. I heard he had a way of knowing things about people." Mrs. Langley's fingers tightened on her shawl, and a faint flush crept up her neck. "Did he?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple continued, her tone as light as if she were discussing the weather. "I've seen it before, you know, in my time. Men like Mr. Grayson, they collect secrets the way some collect stamps, and they use them, don't they, to get what they want." The room was silent, save for the ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Langley's face had gone pale, and her eyes were fixed on the teacup in her lap. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but insistent. "It must be dreadful, carrying a secret like that. The fear that someone might find out. I imagine it could drive a person to—" Mrs. Langley's teacup clattered against its saucer, and she set it down with trembling hands. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice cracked. Betraying her, Miss Marple reached for the button on the side table, holding it up to the light. "This was found at Gossington Hall, you know," she said, "near the window in the library. A curious thing, don't you think? It doesn't match Mr. Grayson's clothing, but it does match a certain woolen coat, one I've seen you wear, Mrs. Langley." The widow's eyes widened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might bolt from the room. But then her shoulders sagged, and she buried her face in her hands. "Oh, Jane," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't want to hurt him." Miss Marple set the button down and leaned back, her expression one of quiet compassion. "Tell me, my dear," she said gently. "Tell me everything." The story poured out of Mrs. Langley like water from a broken dam. Years ago, they had parted ways after a scandal. She had been young, foolish, involved in a scheme Grayson orchestrated. She had rebuilt her life, married, had Clara, and moved to the village to escape her past. But Grayson had found her, recognized her, and begun to blackmail her. He threatened to expose her to Clara, to ruin her daughter's future with Tom, to destroy the quiet life she had built. "He came to my cottage that night," Mrs. Langley said, tears streaming down her face. "He demanded money, more than I could ever give. I told him to leave, but he laughed, said he'd tell everyone. I lost control. I grabbed the scarf from the table, and before I knew it, he was gone." Miss Marple listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. She noted the details: the scarf, a silk one, from Grayson's own collection; the struggle near the window, where the button had fallen; the faint scent of lavender perfume, which Mrs. Langley always wore. It all fit like pieces of a puzzle, clicking into place. "I didn't mean to kill him," Mrs. Langley sobbed. "I just wanted him to stop, for Clara's sake." Miss Marple nodded, her heart heavy. "I understand, my dear," she said, "but the truth must come out, for Clara's sake, and for yours." Mrs. Langley looked up, her eyes filled with fear. "What will happen to me?" Miss Marple reached out and patted her hand. "You must tell Inspector Craddock everything. He's a fair man. He'll listen."